right. So, it's kind of like a given, isn't it? Like this deep down assumption that humans are, well, kind of selfish at their core. I bet if we're honest, we've all had that thought at some point, right? That even when people are being nice, there's some ulterior motive, some angle. Like we're all just hardwired to compete and get ahead no matter what.
Yeah, I think that selfish gene idea from Richard Dawkins' book really cemented that image for a
Mm,
lot of people. It definitely gave a lot of weight to this view of humanity as inherently self-serving.
for sure. It's a pretty powerful concept. And it does seem to line up with, well, a lot of what we see in the world, right? This drive for success, for individual gain. It's kind of everywhere you look.
It is. It seems like a pretty basic motivator in a lot of ways.
Totally. But here's the thing. What if that's not the whole picture? What if at the very root of it all, that image we have of our prehistoric ancestors, constantly fighting it out, this brutal struggle for survival, what if that's actually wrong?
Hmm, interesting.
That's what totally blew my mind about this material you sent over. It throws a wrench in this whole idea of innate selfishness right from the get-go. So that's what we're going to deep dive into today. Were our earliest human societies really these cutthroat, every person for themselves kind of worlds?
It's a huge question. And the piece you sent, it offers a totally different perspective, coming from a psychologist who's looking at how this self-centeredness may have actually developed. It's a direct challenge to a lot of the traditional thinking in evolutionary psychology.
Yeah, so let's start with that. Like, what's the traditional evolutionary psychology take on all this?
Well, the common narrative is that prehistoric life was incredibly harsh, this constant battle against the elements and each other.
Right, survival of the fittest taken to the extreme.
Exactly. And the idea is that in this kind of environment, traits like selfishness, aggression, even ruthlessness, they would have been huge advantages. Those who had those traits would have been more likely to survive, find food, find mates, have kids, and pass on their genes, and that's how those traits would become more common over time.
It's a pretty grim view of our origins, to be honest.
Yeah, it doesn't exactly paint the rosiest picture of early humanity.
No, not really. And it doesn't stop there, right? This competition for resources, for survival, it supposedly extends to how different groups interacted, too. Like, if resources were so scarce, wouldn't that mean constant conflict between different groups of early humans?
That's the idea, and they take that even further to suggest it could be an evolutionary route for things like racism and warfare.
Yeah.
This really deep-seated us versus them mentality we see even today.
Right, this kind of ingrained tribalism baked into our DNA from those early struggles.
Exactly.
But okay, here's where it gets really fascinating. Because the source material you shared, it just flat out challenges this whole assumption of a desperate, dog-eat-dog prehistoric world. It says, hang on a sec, it wasn't actually that crowded back then.
Yeah, this is where things get interesting. The piece points to evidence suggesting that population densities in those times were way lower than we might imagine, like really strikingly low.
Give me some numbers because I'm having trouble picturing it.
Sure, so for example, it says around 15,000 years ago, the entire population of Europe might have been only around 29,000 people. Globally, less than 500,000.
Less than 500,000 people on the entire planet. That's mind-blowing. I mean, think about how many people live in just one city today. So what does that mean for this whole idea of constant competition for resources? If there were so few people spread out over such vast areas, was it really such a fierce battle for survival?
That's the point the source is making. If you've got huge wide open spaces and just a handful of people scattered across them, this intense cutthroat competition for survival that the traditional view is built on, it becomes a lot less likely. Remember, these early humans were hunter-gatherers, right? They relied on what they could hunt and gather from the natural world around them.
Right, living off the land.
Yeah, so with those kinds of population numbers, the idea of constant brutal warfare between groups over hunting grounds or water sources, it doesn't really hold up. There probably would have been plenty to go around. It really makes you rethink that whole survival of the fittest narrative as this constant, vicious battle against each other. Maybe the biggest challenge was just finding enough to live on in this huge, empty world.
Yeah, it totally flips the script. If they weren't constantly at each other's throats fighting for scraps, then maybe all those selfish traits we talked about weren't really the key to survival after all.
Exactly. And the source material takes this even further, looking at evidence from contemporary hunter-gatherer societies groups that live in ways that are thought to be similar to our prehistoric ancestors. And what's really interesting is this consistent observation of something called extreme political and sexual egalitarianism in these societies. The anthropologist Bruce Nauf, he's the one who uses that term.
Egalitarianism. Okay, break that down for me. What does that actually look like in these groups?
Well, basically it means a real lack of hierarchy and a huge emphasis on equality among individuals. Like in a lot of these societies, you don't see people accumulating personal wealth or private property.
Yeah.
It's much more about sharing.
So no prehistoric billionaires hoarding all the best resources.
Nope, not really. There's often a really strong ethical code around sharing everything. If someone comes back with food, it's distributed to the entire group. Possessions tend to be minimal and often shared communally.
So like a totally different mindset about what it means to, I don't know, succeed or be well off. It's not about individual gain, it's about contributing to the whole group.
Right, very much a collective mindset. And these groups have ways of actively preventing anyone from getting too big for their britches, so to speak. You know, if someone starts acting too boastful, too domineering.
The group puts them in check.
Yeah, exactly. They'll have ways to kind of bring that person back down to earth, sometimes through teasing, sometimes even through ostracization. There's this really interesting example with the Kung people of Southern Africa and their hunting practices.
Oh yeah, they do that thing with the arrows, right? Explain that one.
Yeah, so before a hunt, they'll often exchange arrows with each other. So even if one person is a particularly good hunter and they make a kill,
The credit isn't all theirs.
right, socially, the credit for the kill goes to whoever owned the arrow that was used, not necessarily the person who shot it. It's such a clever way of downplaying individual achievement and emphasizing communal success.
Wow, that's amazing. It's like intentionally diffusing any potential for one person to get all the glory and become the star hunter or whatever. It really speaks volumes about what they valued.
It does. And the source also points to the surprising autonomy that women often have in many of these societies. They often have the freedom to choose their own marriage partners, decide what kind of work they do and when they do it, and even have custody rights in case of divorce. It's a very different picture than what we often assume about prehistoric gender roles.
Yeah, we tend to think of it as very male-dominated, the stereotypical caveman calling all the shots. So if this kind of egalitarian, cooperative society was really the norm for tens of thousands of years, like many anthropologists think it was, what does that say about all those so-called innate human traits? Does it mean we're not actually born selfish?
It really raises some fundamental questions about which qualities evolution actually favored during that massive stretch of time. If prehistoric life wasn't this constant free-for-all, then things like racism, warfare, male dominance, all these things that are often attributed to evolutionary pressures in a super competitive environment, they seem a lot less likely to have been strongly selected for.
Because they wouldn't have provided much of a benefit in that kind of world.
Exactly. And in fact, you could argue that people who were too selfish or aggressive would have been actively penalized, like we talked about, through social ostracization. They wouldn't have fit in.
Right, which makes this other idea that's presented in the source material so intriguing. It's suggesting that maybe cooperation, egalitarianism, altruism, even peacefulness, maybe those are actually the traits that are more fundamental to our nature. That for most of human history, those were the qualities that helped us survive and thrive.
That's the core of the argument. These pro-social behaviors, they would have been crucial for keeping groups together, for sharing resources effectively, and ultimately for increasing everyone's chances of survival in a world that wasn't quite as cutthroat as we imagine. And the source even suggests that these deep-seated tendencies might still be with us today, just maybe, kind of hidden or buried under more recent developments.
Okay, so here's the big question then, right? If we were all so cooperative and peaceful back then, why does the world today seem so different? Why do we see so much selfishness, competition, and conflict all around us?
Right, it's the big elephant in the room. And this is where the source gets even more interesting. It proposes that maybe these more, let's say, negative traits, maybe they're actually a more recent phenomenon, triggered by huge changes in our environment and in our psychology over time. It draws a fascinating parallel to studies of primate populations, where their natural habitats have been disrupted.
So like how animals react when their environment changes drastically.
Exactly. And in those cases, what you often see is this increase in aggression and violence. You see these more rigid hierarchies forming within the groups. It's as if the change in the environment brings out these different behaviors that weren't there before.
So what the argument is that something similar might have happened to humans when we shifted away from the hunter-gatherer way of life, when we started settling down and farming.
That's exactly it. That transition from a nomadic hunter-gatherer existence to a more settled agricultural way of life, it likely led to some huge social and psychological changes. The source suggests that it could have fostered a whole new sense of individuality and separateness. With agriculture comes the concept of land ownership, of having surplus resources, and that can lead to a much stronger sense of mine versus yours.
Right. Those lines get a lot more defined, and that paves the way for more selfishness.
It could. And it could also lay the groundwork for the development of hierarchical societies, the emergence of patriarchy, and eventually larger-scale conflict and warfare over resources that are now more concentrated and potentially more contested as populations grow.
It's a pretty powerful idea, isn't it? That this selfishness and competition we see so much of today, maybe it's not actually some deep-rooted instinct, some ancient imperative wired into our brains. Maybe it's more of a learned behavior, or at least a response to a very specific set of circumstances that have only really arisen relatively recently in human history.
Exactly. And the source makes a point of emphasizing that these negative traits seem to show up quite late in our evolutionary timeline, which makes a purely evolutionary explanation for them a bit less convincing.
Right. If they were really so crucial for our survival, wouldn't they have emerged a lot earlier on?
That's the argument. It suggests that maybe our true nature, deep down, is actually more inclined towards cooperation,
Hmm.
and that a lot of the selfishness we see around us is actually product of more recent societal structures and psychological shifts.
So, to sum it all up for everyone listening, what we've really explored in this deep dive is this really interesting challenge to the common assumption that humans are just naturally selfish creatures. We've seen that prehistoric life, it may have been a lot different than we typically imagine. With these super low population densities, the idea of this constant, brutal struggle against each other for survival, well, it becomes a lot less likely. And the evidence from contemporary hunter-gatherer societies, it paints this picture of humans being incredibly egalitarian, incredibly cooperative, constantly sharing, and living in a much more harmonious way.
It really makes you wonder, doesn't it?
It does, and it all points to the possibility that maybe, just maybe, cooperation and altruism, these are actually more fundamental to our nature than we tend to think. And that the selfishness and the competition we see so much of today, it might be a more recent development, something that's emerged as a result of these big shifts in our environment and the way we live.
It's a powerful thought.
Yeah.
And if we can wrap our heads around that, if we can really understand this potential for inherent cooperation and egalitarianism,
Mhm.
well, it could totally change how we view human nature and how we understand the roots of a lot of our current societal structures.
Absolutely. It's a whole new lens to look through. So here's a final thought for everyone to take away and ponder. If cooperation and the sense of fundamental equality, if those things were really so crucial to our survival for most of human history, what does that mean for us today? What does it say about our potential to create societies that are more harmonious, more equitable, and maybe better? Could it be that somewhere along the line we started suppressing those more cooperative instincts that were actually key to our success for so long? It's something to think about, for sure. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive, and we'll see you next time.